Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nick Brand. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs here at the Chicago Council. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening Gerald Posner and Garry Wills, two distinguished journalists, and I'm looking forward to their perspectives tonight. We are on the record this evening, so that means that while you're welcome to use social media, please do silence your phones. We're also live streaming, so if you like what you see this evening, it'll be available on our website tomorrow. After the program, our speakers will be signing copies of their recent books. They'll be available for purchase just outside that door. Gerald's book is called God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. Garry Wills' book is called The Future of the Catholic Church with Pope Francis. We do have a special membership promotion this evening. If you join the council this evening, or if you upgrade your membership, you get a copy of a book of your choice free of charge this evening. So you can pick up either Gerald or Garry's book tonight. We're winding down our program season. We do not do programs in the summer, but we do have a number of exciting upcoming programs still to come in June. On June 18th, we'll be hosting the 2015 Gus Hart Fellow and Social Entrepreneur. His name is Felix Maradiaga, and he'll be discussing rebuilding Central America. On June 23rd, we'll be hosting the Eurasia Group president and founder Ian Bremmer. He'll be discussing Moneyball America, Indispensable America, or Independent America. What role should the United States play in the international order? On June 24th, we'll be welcoming former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Chairman of the Paulson Institute, Hank Paulson, back to the Council. Many of you may have seen him at our opening panel for the Chicago Forum on Global Cities last week. He'll be joined in conversation with the Financial Times' Ed Luce, and they'll be discussing Secretary Paulson's recent book on China. So, to introduce our panel this evening, please join me in welcoming the President and CEO of Big Shoulders Fund and a Chicago Council emerging leader, Josh Hale.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome our panelists, Gerald Posner and Garry Wills, as well as our star moderator, Michelle Wooker from the Council, who are going to reflect with us tonight on a very interesting and timely topic, Pope Francis. Now, one never quite knows what to expect when the white smoke rises from the Vatican chimney, though I do think it's a novel approach to elections, and we might even consider it for our own presidential election as we near 40 candidates in the race. But for me, one of the most interesting keys to understanding Pope Francis is the fact that he's a member of the largest single group of male religious in the Catholic Church, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits have a storied history of being great leaders, of great intellect, of great service to the poor. But they also have been known to be, well, rebel-rousers from time to time. In fact, the Jesuit order has been suppressed twice by a pope, and I think they take a little pride in that. And I believe a quote from a letter that provides great insight to this part of the reputation was in May of 1816. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson about the restoration of the Society of Jesus. I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as printers, publishers, writers, schoolmasters? If ever there was a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is the Society of Loyolas. Now, if you know anything about the Jesuit mystique, and many of you here probably do, you're probably well aware that their motto is captured in the abbreviation AMDG, which stands for the greater glory of God. And this is the way that the Jesuits would like to be and really are viewed in the world in terms of their charism and mission. Now, for my part, I attended the Jesuit University. I spent 2 years overseas in a third world country living and working with the Jesuits. And then I worked with the Jesuits here in Chicago when Cristo Rey Jesuit High School first started. So I've had a little history with them. And through these experiences of working with the Jesuits, I came to see them living out this motto based on 4 distinct pillars that the Jesuits espouse and expect really from their priests, but also from surrogates like me. Live simply, live in community, build faith, and fight for social justice. Now, as a Jesuit, and in fact a former senior leader within the Jesuits, Pope Francis brings a particular perspective, a Jesuit perspective, to the papacy as the first Jesuit ever elected to be Pope. With Pope Francis making his first visit to the United States very soon, since becoming Pope, it's generating obviously a lot of conversation and discussion, given his popularity in some circles. As many of you have surely seen, the Pew poll from March this year gave Pope Francis a favorability rating of 90% among Catholics and 68% among religiously unaffiliated Americans. There are a lot of presidents that would like those numbers. But Pope Francis has been viewed as one of modernizing pontiffs in recent times. Since the white smoke heralded his election, he's made welcoming comments like, "Who am I to judge?" He washed the feet of Muslim women in prison. He's aggressively working to reform the Vatican Bank and the Vatican Curia. He brokered the thawing relations between Cuba and the United States, recognized Palestinian statehood. And this summer, he'll issue a papal encyclical, which I think will generate some interest as well, about tackling climate change. Yet not all appears to be well in his own faith community. His modernizing agenda and his statements on political and social issues have posed a challenge to entrenched interest on both liberal and conservative elements in the church. Even his own priests, bishops, and cardinals are seemingly trying to sort out how to receive Pope Francis in his message. Most recently, he echoed the Jesuit charism of living in the world and working with the poor that St. Ignatius espoused when he said to his priest, "This is what I'm asking you, be shepherds with a smell of sheep." So what opposition exists from both sides of the aisle? What exactly is his agenda? What can he actually accomplish? Well, these are the common questions that are coming up more and more, and we're fortunate to have Gerald Posner and Garry Willis here to help us to understand more about the Jesuit Pope, Pope Francis, and his pontificate, and the challenges he and the church he leads is facing. Gerald Posner is an investigative journalist and author of several best-selling books. He's a freelance writer for many news magazines and is a regular contributor on NBC, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. Garry Willis is a professor emeritus at Northwestern University, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist, and historian who has written over 40 books on American history, politics, and religion. And again, as I said, we have Michelle Wooker here as a vice president of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and she was a former president of the World Policy Institute, and we're lucky to have her here in Chicago with us now. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcoming our great panel and a great discussion.
Great, thanks, Josh. That was a wonderful kickoff, and I have to say, I'm really honored to be here with you both tonight because I owe a lot to the Jesuits, my parents having met at a Jesuit university. So I'm here because of the Jesuits. I'm very, very grateful. You know, Pope Francis is an amazing person to talk about. I mean, he's got 6 million followers on Twitter at Pontifex. I mean, he's incredibly well liked, as the numbers show. He's energetic. He's a reformist. You know, he thinks all animals go to heaven, which makes me very, very happy. He's hugely popular among non-Catholics. Raul Castro credits the Pope with bringing him back to the Catholic Church. And as I learned this morning through a bit of a social media war, he actually has a degree in chemistry, so can actually disprove the notion that science and the church do not go together. He's just amazing, but both of you have spent a lot more time studying what he's been doing in the context of the whole church. I'm curious how each of you sees, how do you explain his popularity? How did he get to be this Rolling Stone cover rock star figure?
Well, he's not popular with everybody, as has been said, but most people forget he was not popular with his fellow Jesuits, and he says it was his fault. When he was provincial of the Jesuits, he had a great falling out with them, and feelings were so hard that for years, when he became an archbishop, he would not stay at a Jesuit house when he went to Rome. He had arranged for retirement in a non-Jesuit retirement home. He had arranged for burial in a non-Jesuit cemetery. Now, why was that? Luckily for him, he was raised to bishop, archbishop, cardinal by a man who despised the Jesuits, John Paul II. It's a great puzzle why John Paul II, who had a very strict test of whom he would promote Bergoglio. And part of the reason is that he had the falling out with the Jesuits. The Pope almost suppressed the Jesuits when the general of the Jesuits, whom he did not like, retired after a time when there was an acting general whom he disliked even more. He refused to let the Jesuits elect their own general for the first time in history. He sent in his own men. And then after there was some kind of taming of the hostility, he let the Jesuits finally elect someone. But the Bergoglio was a man of very mixed reputation, which probably helped him be elected. During the Dirty War, he had not come out strongly for liberation theology, as most of the Jesuits did. He thought it was too dangerous. It would expose his priests to a military government that was disappearing people. So there was great hardship, great hard feeling rather, and he was sent abroad to calm things down. So it was in that equivocal state that the Pope raised him. But as an archbishop, though he had not formally supported liberation theology, he acted as if he had. He went into the slums. He did all the things that he's doing now as Pope. Traveled on the buses, lived very simply, had extremely good relations with Jews and Muslims and women, for the reason that he reminded them of Jesus. He wanted to get rid of all the shells, the vestments, the palaces that kept people away from the institutional church. And as soon as he came in, he, of course, called up the Jesuits and reknit the bonds that had existed before. He went out of his way to do that. He gave a 6-hour interview over 3 days with the Jesuit journals. So that was a good solving of ancient problems. On the other hand, he was elected because he was not too dangerous, but he was at least reformist enough, because he came in at a very difficult time. There were scandals accumulating and multiplying and intensifying. Financial scandal, which we'll hear about. Cultural scandal of careerism and clericalism, which he's quietly been working against. Sexual scandal with all of the cover-up of abusive priests. And doctrinal scandal. How then the church had drifted away from the people's practice in all kinds of ways. In contraception, 90% of women practice it. And the bishops are saying, oh, you can't do that. That God doesn't let you do that. You'll go to hell if you do. So he has all of those scandals to deal with, and he has, just down the street, the living predecessor of the papacy. That's never happened before. There have been living predecessors, but they were disgraced and often killed. They were not neighbors, and they were not in good standing with the church. And so this pope has to placate all of his loyalists in the Curia, in the Vatican, and around the world. So it's a very difficult thing. He can't insult his predecessor. He has to get along with him. He's doing that, of course. In his major statement, The Joy of the Gospel, Benedict is quoted just constantly. You look at the back where the notes are, and it's Benedict this, Benedict that, Benedict, all of those things. But people who are loyalists to Benedict and to John Paul before are very much on edge about him. For instance, even when he does something as simple as not living in the palace, not wearing fancy ecclesiastical garb, going out to the poor, washing the feet of women and Muslims, they take that as an insult to his predecessor, who was, of course, a fancy dresser and very strict on women, tried to investigate the American nuns to death. So almost every move he makes is scrutinized very narrowly by the people who elected him. They did want reform, but not too much. And it turns out that at each step he does along that path, there are some people who are saying that's too much. So how he lives through those kind of pressures is going to be a very interesting story.
So, in addition to what Professor Wills was saying, one of the reasons for his popularity is Benedict. He had the benefit of following a very dour pope, in at least his public countenance. And this has worked for popes in the past as well. When the end of Pius XII in 1958, Pius, very autocratic pope, quite at the end of his tenure, replaced by the wonderfully ebullient John XXIII, who suddenly went back to the task of washing the feet of prisoners and being friendly and outgoing. He didn't have the equivalent of Twitter to measure his popularity, but I remember my Italian grandmother thought he was the greatest pope in the world because he was a populist. Popes need to be populist occasionally. He certainly had that, and Paul VI then brings it back to a much more introverted papacy, and by the end of his papacy, when we come into that 1978 conclave, he's so riddled by arthritis, he can barely get out of bed without tremendous pain. His only time that he makes it out of the Vatican to say a Mass is to say the memorial Mass outside of St. Peter's for Aldo Moro, when his good friend Aldo Moro was assassinated. And it's a crippled papacy, and that's reflected somehow in the faithful. And John Paul II, John Paul I is so short-lived, but John Paul II, this populist Polish prelate, comes in, and the popularity again surges. And so in some ways, Francis has the benefit, Bergoglio has the benefit of following a pope that didn't have all of that charisma, and that adds to his popularity. We're ready to embrace it.
So how much of his popularity is that sort of optics of contrast? I mean, Benedict wasn't the most liked of the popes we've had recently. How much of that is just the sheer breath of fresh air, and how much of that is what he's doing, who he is, and how much of it we got a little bit of a sense from Professor Wills is that there's this real contrast between how popular he is publicly, but behind the scenes he's really getting some pushback, particularly from the more conservative members of the clergy.
Professor Wills will certainly, talks about this in his book as well, about what he can do in terms of laying the groundwork for change in the future that may take place beyond his papacy, that he's not going to tackle himself. But I know that he's getting pushback inside of the financial reforms. There are traditionalists inside that think that he's moving a little too fast, that he's embracing the reforms from Brussels and the European Union too quickly. It's not just optics. In the beginning, for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months, the freshness of his personality would have carried the day, and that he was on Times Man of the Year and on the cover of The Advocate as well would have been wonderful. But then the substance needs to be there, and the substance has been there in large part. It's not to say that everything he's done is correct, but it's interesting that if you talk to and I think that Garry Wills talks about this as well in his book, if you talk to a liberal Catholic, they say, well, he's not moving fast enough in changing all the trappings of the church. There's still too much power and glory around the Vatican. And then you talk to a conservative and they think he's about to change every doctrinal piece of theology overnight. So he's got both camps worried, which is a good sign. And maybe it's the last time they'll elect a Jesuit for a long time. I went to Jesuit high school. I know I have a Jesuit seminarian over here. So we have Jesuits influence all around on this stage. They may have had their one touch with Jesuits.
Yeah. Have people overestimated just how liberal he is?
No, Professor Wills may disagree with this, but I think that in the conclave they may have underestimated how liberal he is. They thought that what Garry Wills said before, which is that he didn't embrace liberation theology, meant that he was a conservative somehow for a South American prelate, and that wasn't true at all. When he comes here in the States, he's going to say things, I think, this September that'll set people's ears on Wall Street burning. So it'll be quite a time.
What do you think? Have people underestimated or overestimated how liberal he is, how much change he's out to make?
I don't know. We liberals have a lot of wishful thinking. But I'm glad you brought up John the 23rd, because people forget Bergoglio came in second at the conclave that chose Benedict. And he was asked at the time, had you won, what name would you have taken? And he said, John the 24th, which told you the direction he wanted to move in. And the interesting thing about John the 24th, people now say he instituted change. He didn't. It would be against the people of God view of the church to dictate from on high what reform will be. So he called the Second Vatican Council, and the fathers of the council called in a whole generation of theologians who had been silenced by Pius XII, and they brought about the change. Now this Pope, I think, wants to do the same thing. He's trying to set up commissions, he's trying to set up ways to have not for him to tell them what to say. And that's the promising thing. It's even more interesting that 8 years later, when he was elected, he didn't choose John the 24th. He became much more radical. He chose Francis, never chosen by a bishop, by a pope before. And Francis was never a priest. He was never a part of the hierarchy. He was never a clericalist. He was never a careerist. All the things that this pope is attacking, subtly and sometimes not too subtly. But to take the name Francis is to be subversive. Francis was too radical for even his own followers. They split up right after he died and went off into observant and spiritualist and other things because he was much too close to Jesus for the church to be comfortable.
I love the idea of a subversive pope with a subversive history to follow. But I wanted to go back into a little about the history that's in your book. You're really writing about how Catholic doctrine changes over time. You look at the evolution of anti-Semitism, for example, on church-state relations, natural law ethics on sexuality and gender. And I think these are some of the things that particularly more liberal-minded Catholics are going to be looking to Pope Francis to create change on. And I'm curious, do you think that there's a risk of overstating his ability to bring these changes about?
Well, I don't think he overstates it. I don't think he's trying to bring these changes about by himself. He knows that that would be shallow, that it would be prompting not only conservative resistance, but liberal resistance, that I'm the Pope, so I can tell you all what to think and do. That's not his approach at all. In fact, he doesn't even like the title Pope. He said, I'm the Bishop of Rome. And when they say you were promoted, he said, I just changed dioceses. I was the Bishop of Buenos Aires, and now I'm the Bishop of Rome. Now that's very John the 23rd in the approach that he has to encourage the people of God, which is the church, to speak up. So when he called the synod to Rome of bishops, he said, go out and question your flock, and then bring in their concerns. And they did that to a little extent. But this was a preparatory synod, and there's another one coming up this year. And he did something very shrewd. The synod, the meeting of the bishops of the world, was instituted by the Second Vatican Council as a way to make the collegiality of the leadership of the church strong. At first that worked, but when John Paul came in, he said, we'll call the synod, but we will keep it secret. No one will know anything about it but what you submit to me, and I will do what I want with it. Totally perverting the whole point of the synod. Now, what could the Pope have done? He could have said ahead of time, we're going to go back to the Second Vatican Council. But he let them argue. Some people thought it was a setback that there was a preliminary statement which caused conservative concern, and they watered it down. But he said, he gave at the end a magnificent speech, and he said, I'm so glad there was disagreement. I want you just to voice what you truly think. Otherwise, we can't come to some kind of joint meeting. But he said, let's publish the whole proceeding. It wasn't kept secret. It wasn't just submitted to him. And so bishops who didn't really consult their flock last time, there's kind of a reason to consult them this time. And this time they go in knowing ahead of time that their vote will be recorded. They'll have to answer to their own people on kinds of things that the people disagree and have disagreed with their bishops for a long time. So it's a strategy that's very winning. So I think, I don't know about the degree of liberalism or conservatism, I think we've underestimated his maneuverability. He's very shrewd.
You've described a very, very political process. I'm curious, looking back through history, is this similar to the ways that doctrine has changed in the past? Is it leadership? Is it a change in the zeitgeist? Is it political skill? Is it the atmosphere within the church? What are the ingredients that make it possible to create change?
Well, there's great resistance, especially when the Pope started claiming to be infallible. How can you change if you're infallible in the first thing you did? What has happened frequently in the church is not that there was any formal renunciation of something. It's just that it became so unenforceable that people just walked away from it. For instance, interdicts, very powerful weapon of the Pope for years. When he disagreed with some order or nation or king, he would slap on an interdict, meaning you can't administer the sacraments. You'll have to die without confession. You'll have to be kept from Eucharist. That was never renounced. People just ignored it. The way they're ignoring the teaching on contraception right now. Indulgences. The people have just walked away from indulgences. It's not been formally taken back, and John Paul made a couple of gestures to it. Indulgences were, if you went on pilgrimage or did something like that, you would get out of purgatory for some years, or if it's a plenary indulgence, you'd get scot-free. Usury, for many years, there was a teaching that you could never take interest on a loan. That was never formally renounced. People just walked away from it. That's what's happening now. For instance, confession was a very important thing, and after all, it's called a sacrament. People have just stopped going. There's several books on the falling off of people in England and parts of Europe and America. So as they have totally ignored contraception, those things then become dead letters. The living church, the people who actually believe and carry on their lives in loving each other and people in the path of Jesus, we just shuffle. In fact, Pius IX, when he denounced democracy, free speech, and the trappings of the modern liberal world, Lord Acton, the Catholic historian, said when the English authorities said, our Catholic people are never going to obey us. They've been forbidden to exercise free speech. And Acton said, oh, don't worry. You don't know the half of what a pope can say that the people ignore.
That's great. I want to move now to an area for change that probably is a little thornier than just people stopping to do it. There's probably going to take a little bit more forceful effort by the Pope, the show me the money part of the change. Gerald, your research into the Vatican's financial arrangement shows a sprawling and powerful web of intrigue. It's not like a movie trailer here, but really a web of spanning the globe. And the Vatican Bank is at the center of the network. It's something very, very, very big and complicated, and a lot of interests at stake, obviously. And I'd love your opinion on what progress it's possible for Pope Francis to make in reforming this, in bringing greater financial transparency to things, or are the entrenched interests within the Vatican Bank so strong that he's just not going to be able to make any headway, or make very limited headway?
Well, I think, Michelle, that when my wife Tricia and I started researching this back in 2005, so it's been 9 years on this book, I thought it was only the Vatican Bank forward. So I was going to start in 1942 and run it to the current time. Instead, it turns out to be a 200-year history of Vatican finances, in part from what you just heard from Professor Wills, which is that here's an institution that thought usury, you could not loan interest, have interest earned on a loan. How did it turn out to have something like the Vatican Bank? And of course, it turns out to be because we all remember they were Pope kings. They had that dual hat. They had their own empire. They had 15,000 miles of central Italy that were the papal states, and they made their income the same way that monarchs did all around Europe, by levying taxes and fees. And until 1870, that worked pretty well, unless you had a pope who was spending too much, which they occasionally had. But once they lost the empire, when Italy becomes unified and it becomes this little postage stamp sized piece of real estate, and you have a prisoner pope who refuses to go out because they're no longer a sovereign, then they have trouble. So Peter's Pence helps, and they're raising donations. But it is really Mussolini who hits the deal with them for the Lateran Pax in 1929 that changes the entire equation, I think, for what we're talking about today in terms of the finances. He grants them sovereignty. Says, you are as sovereign as you ever have been. It's just a smaller piece of real estate. You're now a country. They acknowledge him as the rightful head of Italy. And then in 1942, this wonderful, brilliant, sort of lay financial expert that Pius XII is using, Bernardino Nogaro, says we need a bank. We need the equivalent of a quasi between a central bank and an investment bank. They need it in part because the Americans and the British are looking very, very hard to stop sovereign neutrals like the Vatican from doing business with the Germans and the Italians. 98% of the Curia, they're all Italians at that time. Their brothers are on the other side of the wall fighting for the fascist military. They're involved in business, they're involved in banking, they're involved in industry. It's very hard for them. They are men in the end, they are mortal, and they have a feeling that they would like to see the Italians prosper in the war. And I think that the bank, from its inception, is in the dark. It's operating with a lot of money, and that's created problems over the decades. When you ask the question, is it possible, is he able to push the reforms together today that are necessary? The reason I say yes, with only a slight hesitation, is that he has no choice. And what I mean by that is, even if we didn't have this magical Pope in Bergoglio, now Francis, talking about him in such a great way of what the expectations are, whoever was Pope today would have to be making many of these reforms when it came to the Vatican Bank. And the decision for that actually came in '99, at a time when Benedict was Pope, because Italy gave up the lira. And the Vatican used the Italian lira as its currency, and it put them in a bind. What were they to do? They have a discussion. I talk about this in the bank. The internal discussion is interesting. They really consider printing their own money. They decide at the end they can't do that, so they'll go with the euro. And what most of them didn't understand at that moment is going with the euro meant that they subjected themselves to some type of oversight from Brussels, that Brussels would want to come in and see that this bank had things like laws against money laundering, laws against the financing of terrorism, a certain limit to the amount of cash that you could bring into the city-state without declaring it. The first laws against money laundering were passed in 2011. the first laws against terrorist financing in 2011 and 2012. They finally have a limit of 10,000 euros that you can bring in. Before, you could bring in a truckload of cash if you wanted to. So Europe is making sure that they are compliant with the OECD white list. They are now on the gray list. They could have been on the black list like Luxembourg. Benedict started the reforms. What I credit Francis with is that he has invigorated them. He's not just done the minimum required, but he's brought in some great independent outsiders. He's shaken up the system, and he's doing what's necessary, but with a level of intensity that I credit him for in particular. I do think he's on the road to turning this into a compliant, boring, mid-level bank going forward. The wild days are probably over. Except for an occasional scandal here or there, but
Just a little bit of a...
as with every bank.
Well, how much do you think that this new oversight has uncovered all of the problems that need to be solved, or are there other things lurking under the surface that are going to rear their heads, and we're going to be amazed and overwhelmed at what we don't even know is there?
I'd be shocked if things didn't raise their head that we don't know about yet. They've closed 4,000 accounts in the last 2 years. About 3,200 of those were accounts that had expired, meaning when they did the first count, they had more counts than names of cardinals and cardinals who were alive. So they were bad at closing accounts. They have about 700 accounts that really shouldn't have existed at all. They've closed all the accounts to questionable characters. They've signed a tax treaty with Italy, which now means they're sharing tax data back to 2009, which scares a lot of Italians who have used it for tax evasion for years. But I think that in the process of cleaning it out, there's a Swiss, Brulhart, who's running the equivalent of their SEC now, will uncover probably a few more things, such as the Giulio Andreotti was what? The most powerful post-war prime minister or Italian politician in post-war Italy. 7 times Italian prime minister. What did we find out in the 2000s? We found out that he had been running a political slush fund in the Vatican Bank under the name of the Cardinal Spellman Foundation. There was no such thing in the world other than in the Vatican Bank called this particular foundation. And through it, he ran about $60 million over a period of 6 years, paying everybody from his wife's Florentine jeweler to other Christian Democratic politicians for payoffs. It was the source of a slush fund for politics that you couldn't rival. And what it gave the Vatican was the knowledge that J. Edgar Hoover had when he was running the FBI. It gave them the knowledge of power, knowing what the Christian Democrats were doing because they were running it through the bank, gave them that type of influence with the party. Those days are over. But will there come more little disclosures, what I call mini bombs along the way? I would think so in the next year or so.
Great. In the next year.
Stay
So
tuned.
hold, yes, hang on to your seats. I want to turn to this sort of more local angle on the discussion. Chicago's new archbishop has recently announced quite a bold reorganization of the archdiocese here. He's created a new Hispanic council. He's raised the visibility of women within the archdiocese and has appointed Betsy Boland as CEO. I'm very, very curious on your take on what this means for Chicago, and particularly, is this part of a new vision by the Pope that would elevate local leaders, as in Chicago, as really the vanguard of reform in the Catholic Church?
Well, sure. He has said to every bishop and to every priest, you're shepherds. That means you should be out with your sheep. You should know the smell of the sheep. He said, when I was going to the slums in Buenos Aires, I knew priests who knew the name of every dog in that slum. Now that's priesthood. Sure, Supich is a very promising and good appointment. Some of his have not been, unfortunately. In Chile, he's appointed someone who's very unpopular, apparently with reason. But he's been fairly sure-footed so far. And, if you read that wonderful book about the finances, or you read my book about all kinds of horrible things, you must go away thinking, boy, what a rotten church. And then why am I still in it? It's like any institution. It's not a perfect institution. It never was. has tried to pretend that. No human institution is perfect. Augustine said the church it will never be perfect until it goes to heaven. And I don't know who's going there. But large institutional sin happens all the time. For instance, if you look closely at the history of America, you will find horrible sins. What greater sin could there be than to sell and use and force labor from other human beings? Slavery stains our history, and we're all complicit because 12 of our presidents were slaveholders, including the ones we think of as the greatest: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson. But we still love America, work for America, try to make it better, try to escape that terrible, terrible legacy of slavery. And we have to do the same thing with the things that have gone wrong in the church. And every now and then, we get a pope who's a Christian. That's the good reason to stay in the church. But of course, I know many Catholic Christians, priests, bishops, nuns, the people who taught me. That's the real church and the promise of the church that's always there under all of the sinful things. And how do you get rid of a legacy like that of slavery or Indian removal and the theft of a continent from them? Well, there's a mixture of denial, repentance, some kind of reparation or admission of guilt, and eventually you have to work out some way to live with yourself by a mutual absolution, that we're not going to keep blaming ourselves for slavery on every occasion and every second. So we have to live through the faults and the sins of the institutions, whether they're national, collegial, ecclesiastical. They're always there. What we have to do is hope that the Christ-like qualities will outlast the sin.
And if I could say one thing, what Professor Wills talks about in this institutional sense, I think is germane from what I've done in this work on this book. And I talk sometimes about the sins of the Vatican Bank, and clearly one of them is in World War II, in which new information indicates that the Nogaro and the bank owned through Italian proxies shares in German and Italian insurers in Eastern Europe, in the killing fields of Eastern Europe, on countries like Generali and Munich Reinsurance and Allianz, that in 1943 and 44 were cheating the life insurance policies of Jews that they knew were dying in the death camps and were having outsized profits, and those profits were reflected at the Vatican Bank. I don't think that the Pope or any of the religious hierarchy knew about it. They didn't want to know the details. They just knew that Nogaro was turning out enormous profits. One of the questions is, how do you deal with that as an institution? And this is up to Francis. Francis has the possibility, if he has so much on his plate, and I'm hoping that this is one of the things he will consider, is moving forward to release the wartime files, the Holocaust-era files of Pius XII. The Vatican has a rule. It's not hard and fast. Rules change, as you know, in the Vatican, but the Vatican's general rule is nothing will be released in its entirety until 75 years after the beginning of a pontificate. For Pius XII, that means that on March the 2nd of 2014 was the first day on which those files could have been released. In May of 2014, Francis went to Jerusalem. He went to Yad Vashem. He visited the Middle East. There were a number of Jewish groups that thought maybe he would use that trip as the opportunity to release the files or give a timetable for the release of those files in the future. He has not yet. Those files, the questions of the wartime pope, the questions over was there more to do or not enough to do, the defenders of Pius versus those who to castigate him is one of the great debates inside the church for the war. Those files would be very important. And to the extent that Francis is willing to open those files up, and maybe some of the Vatican Bank files from World War II, he will not have made amends, as you would say, for the institutional sins, but he would have created a clear path going forward of transparency. He will have real resistance to doing that. But I think he's capable of possibly opening the door to serious researchers and historians. At least I'm hopeful.
Great. I'm going to open this in a minute to questions from the audience. So get your questions teed up. There are some people around the room with microphones. But as you're getting your thoughts together, I just have one more question for Gerald. You took 9 years to write this book, to really delve into a very, very secretive institution. And you've uncovered some things that haven't been public before. I'm very curious, what kind of reaction, if any, have you gotten from the Vatican?
I see Professor Wills is chuckling there. Now, actually, no reaction officially. I sent a copy of the book by FedEx to the Pope with a cover letter that I thought was rather wonderful. As a matter of fact, the original, there's one good thing about being slow. Tricia and I were supposed to finish this book and publish in 2011. Then we were late by a year, and late by another year, and late by another year, and we ended up publishing under a different pontificate, which was wonderful. We would have published under Benedict, so I wouldn't have had this note of optimism at the end, possibly, that I have now. But the church was not helpful in the research. They did not let me into the secret archives. Basically, the press office ignored the request for interviews, and that forced me to go out then to the archives of other countries, from Poland to Romania to the Generali files. So it actually forced us to put together the story from a different way. But I think that I've received nothing at all from the church, and their view is they have the long view. They have the long, they survived Napoleon took the secret archives back to France and lost some along the way. They've survived the ransacking of the Huns. They've survived Hitler. They can certainly survive a book that raises some uncomfortable financial questions by just staying quiet for a few months.
Great. I want to move to questions for the audience. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes. If you could identify yourself, please. Please keep your question to a question and not a mini lecture. And please wait for the microphone. I think there's a in the middle, second row in. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Mariana Niddle, and I appreciate so much your comments tonight. Mr. Posner, could you address the resistance that the Pope comes up against? Give us a glimpse of what that looks like, and how does he overcome the kind of resistance that you mentioned?
Well, I think in part he overcomes, he has to balance it. So he isn't just having a scorched earth policy through the Vatican. He is paying respect to some things that he would probably not do if he just had his own way of doing it. Perfect example, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is continuing as within the Vatican. There were some people that thought this Pope might do away with it, not just that. Mueller, the bishop's been appointed to a cardinal. He's very conservative. He's Pope Benedict's choice. I don't think he's really Francis's choice, but Francis is keeping him in place. So he is trying to, at some point, stay with choices that really aren't close to his heart, because he knows he has to compromise. He is Pope, but he understands the limits of that. And at the same time, push forward on those issues that are the most important to him. So that's why when I talk about, for instance, whether he'll open up Pius XII files, I don't know if that's dear and near enough to his heart. If it's worth the political capital, I would hope it is, but that he might have to spend on that versus something he has to do for the Vatican Bank, or something he might want to do on a doctrinal issue, or something that he might want to do when it comes to contraception. He can't do it all. And so with that in mind, I think it's, in small bits, you see him moving forward. But one of the risks that we have as Catholics is to have expectations too high, to think that it's all going to get done very, very fast. It's a slow-moving institution, and you push it too fast, it pushes back.
I think over second over.
My name is Tom Zuro, and I have a question for Professor Wills. Tell me if this is correct, if I read this right about Pope Francis I. Was he at one time a bouncer in a nightclub?
Best question of the night.
Yes. It was a minor job as a young man. He was a number of things as a young man. It's been mentioned that he has a master's degree in chemistry. For 3 years, he worked during the off hours when he was studying in a laboratory which did pretty progressive experiments on chemical constituents of food and things like that. It would be like working in the Food and Drug Administration now. So he knows, and what they did were experiments of some sophistication. So he knows about scientific method. All that early time is really interesting because he's a good learner. The mistakes he made as a provincial, he said, I didn't consult enough. He made what he thought was the best decision for himself, and he didn't bring along other people. So he couldn't keep even his own Jesuits abreast of what he wanted to do. So I don't know that being a bouncer will help him much in this exercise.
Great. I want everyone to get a chance. We've got several more lined up. And in the front row here.
Avi Porat, thank you for your presentations. I have a question. If you see the Pope getting more involved in political issues, like some older popes have been involved, there were a couple of small examples. He had an opinion about the Armenian genocide, he had the opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian thing, which he changed a week later. But do you see him getting more involved in that area, or does he going to focus mostly on the economic and church issues?
I think that you will see him involved in politics. You've seen it in Cuba. You've seen it with Palestine, and you'll continue to see it, I think, there. And clearly, he's not afraid of doing that. One of the things in the conversation that I've had since the publication of my book with people in Rome is that those who want him to get involved in politics, who think that he might stumble there and hit a tripwire, are some of the Italian cardinals. Because the people in Rome who want to see a stumble more than anybody else almost, and I can't say this as a broad brush, but are the Italians, they want the papacy back. You know, they lost after 450 years to a Pole in 1978, and then they didn't get it back in 2005, and it went to a German. Well, you know, they were going to get it back in 2013, and now it's with an Argentine, and Argentinians may think they're Italian, but it's not the same. So, and they're less than a majority now. They can't get the papacy back. So I do think that there are a few of them that would like to see him. They think that politics is an area that he will lose some of that. You take a political stance, and the people who you agree with you love it, and those who don't pull away. So it's hard to keep your overall popularity once you do that.
Well, you know, moral problems are political problems, inevitably. I think his approach is to come at it from really basic morality, namely poverty. He says this world is keeping huge amounts of the population in sub-living standards, and there's no excuse for that. Now, he was attacked for saying, oh, he believes in trickle-down, or he doesn't, rather. And he's got two things he's trying to do, and I think we'll see it in the encyclical on the environment. He's going to say, climate change is really taking the poor who are in bad shape and making them abysmally worse. That's the moral approach to a political question. Another of his priorities is peace, trying to make people be reconciled, and in the Cuban case, for instance. But mainly, the thing I look at most is that as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was on very good terms with the sheikh of the mosque in Buenos Aires. He went there, he prayed there. When the sheikh died, he went to the funeral and prayed there. In his major statement so far, he has said, the joy of the gospel, the Quran is a great spiritual classic, and those who worship God on that path have spiritual treasures we can learn from. There's only one God, whether you call him Allah or Yahweh or Jesus or whatever, at a time when there are some people trying to push the two major faiths in the world, each with 1.5 billion Muslims and Christians, into hostility, I think his greatest political assignments, and I hope it's an achievement, will be to get mutual respect between these two faiths.
Hey, next question. Is there someone in the back of the room? I wanted to make sure we're, yes, all the way in the back there, behind you. But I should be sure everyone's included.
My name is Jerry Keenan. Professor Wills, could you comment a little bit about the globalization of the leadership of the church that you start to see in the selection of cardinals and other people?
Globalization, if that means incorporating the third world to an extent it has not been so far, obviously that is a great cause for him. He may have been elected in part because he comes from third world countries, from Latin America. The church has been moving in the direction of creating bishops from remote places, and he's done that so far. His appointments have been very spread out. He certainly doesn't give priority to Italians anymore. So I think that trying to bring together the more conservative people in the undeveloped world, the people who have had the European Enlightenment, is a very difficult task, and one that he's well equipped, as far as anybody is, to speak for the cause of non-Europeans. Not only is he the first Jesuit, but he's the first non-European in a long time, and first from the Americas. So he is himself a walking globalization of the church.
Third row from the back.
Dr. Wills, is the Pope a salvation universalist, or for him is Jesus the only pathway to heaven?
Oh no, he certainly said Jesus is not the only pathway to heaven. He said everyone who seeks God, prays to God, is taking his own journey there. The idea that Catholics have a monopoly on the Holy Spirit. The only way God can act to give grace to anybody is through the conduit of the Pope and the bishops and the priests. He's never believed that. His relations with Jews and Muslims proves that. And not many Catholics believe that anymore. I grew up at a time when you couldn't go into a Protestant church because that would be countenancing error. We're way beyond that. We've walked away from that, as I say. We walk away from the silly things that some popes adopt.
In the second row here, second from the aisle.
First of all, thank you both very much for all the work you did to bring all of this to us. But Gerald, you mentioned that the popes were monarchs, and I guess I wonder if you think he will use, and it's really a follow-up to Avi's question about using the power of his spirituality on a world that is so broken and in such tumult right now. How do you see that playing out?
Yes, I think that what Garry Wills said a moment ago is very true, that politics is intertwined here with moral issues that confront the church, and that he will be using, to the extent that he can, that power of the bully pulpit. It's a very powerful pulpit for a very tiny country. It's the only country in the world, by the way, that owns more property outside of the actual sovereign boundary of the country than the sovereign itself. And it is part of the problem in the past, this duality that it has. The 700 to 800 men, and they're all men, there are women in Vatican City, but those in terms of power, the 700 to 800 men who run the church also run the country. And we forget about that. So it's not as though there are two groups. It's not as though we have a group of cardinals who are very adept at running the sovereign and they decide what the political issues are and what they should do regarding this at the UN. No, the same ones who are making the decisions on what to do about a crisis or a doctrine are also those who are running the country. They don't necessarily have the same talents, but they have to in this case. And that's unusual. There's no other church like it. I think that Francis will very much try to use the power of his papacy to leave an effect on a world that is in turmoil in a lot of different areas, outside of just what is strictly Catholic approach.
A question in the back of the room there, and we'll try to keep the next couple questions very short, because I know there are a lot of people who want to get them in, and we've only got a few minutes left.
John Polakowski. I was wondering about Cardinal Pell's role in the cleanup of the Vatican Bank, and where do you see it going now because of the crisis in the last few days where he's been attacked on the sexual abuse matter? Do you think the Pope will just decide he has to keep him at the Vatican Bank and ignore the sexual abuse crisis relative to Pell?
I'll make this as short as possible to get to more questions, but I think that Pell is at some risk because the material coming out of Australia is very hard. Professor Will said before, Francis hasn't been perfect on all his choices. That happened in Chile with an appointment of a cardinal. Pell's a very good choice in terms of the finances, as this uber financier, but he came with a little bit of baggage over his handling of the pedophilia crisis, which is now reaching a crescendo. He clearly was doing some good things in the finances because the press back against him was the leaking information that he had a very luxurious lifestyle and liked to have his garments made by a bespoke tailor and was spending too much money. That meant to me that he was actually making changes and people were leaking that information who were working under him because they didn't like him. But now he has a more serious problem. I think the Pope will stay with him as long as possible, but he may step aside if he thinks he starts to hold the financial reform back.
Great. We've got another question in the front row here.
Thank you both. I'm Joan Porat. What influence do you see the signing of the Nostra Aetate affecting the way things are done under this Pope? I think would see a little bit different depending on what the Pope wants to do with it. Have you noticed anything that would indicate that he's paying particular attention?
Yes. She asked about Nostra Aetate, the Vatican Council statement on Jews. Ended the suspense. Well, they really didn't kill Christ. It's about time that was admitted. He is a very active friend of Jewish leaders, both in Buenos Aires and in Rome. And I think, as with Muslims, his attitude is not the grudging one of some of the people who passed Nostra Aetate, but one of welcoming communion with all people who believe in God and want to work with other believers. So he will be, more than anyone who's been in that office so far, I think, a champion of Nostra Aetate.
Another question in the front row here.
Thank you. A question maybe, excuse me, for Mr. Posner, though I hesitate to ask this question considering you've discounted every conspiracy theory since the crucifixion. But I'll ask it anyway. And you mentioned it in your book. And this came out very much during the Vatican Bank scandal with Cardinal Marcinkus, our friend from Cicero. I was just wondering, is there still a covert Masonic element in the Vatican Bank, et cetera, or would that not be something you are privy to?
It is possible that I could believe that there was a Masonic element in the Vatican and still not believe that it led to a conspiracy, though, if anything. So they're not necessarily, they could be mutually exclusive, but it is interesting that while Marcinkus had all of his problems in the 70s and 80s, there were accusations that 130 ranking prelates, monsignors, and bishops inside of Vatican City were in fact members of a Masonic lodge, including Marcinkus. They adamantly denied it, those on the record. They said they'd never even heard of the lodges they were supposed to be members of. I think in most cases that was just bad Italian news reporting. One of the first things that René Brulhart, head of the enforcement branch now of the Vatican Finances, said to Tricia and me when we met him in Rome, I'm not Opus Dei. No Masonic affiliation, so I thought that was interesting without even having to ask. So the days of the Masons may have reached a crescendo in the 70s and 80s, and I think that to the extent that there's anything in Vatican City today, unless Professor Wills knows something other, it's not much of a force.
And we have a question in the second row here.
Well, my name is Damien Barden.
Microphone's coming.
My question has to do with the potential for changes for the role of women in the church.
Yeah, the role of the women up until recently has been zero. And unfortunately, some people think, well, unless he makes women priests, he's not done anything in this field. The priesthood itself is dwindling physically, numerically, but it's also dwindling in importance. The idea that only a priest could hand out communion, for instance, was held until quite recently. Now women do many things. In my church, which is a campus church at Northwestern, we've had 6 or 7 priests dropped in on us. We never have a say in it. The bishop assigns him and takes him. But we've had 2 women over 25 years who are always there and do things like prepare people for baptism, prepare them for marriage, catechize them. One of them has given homilies until the cardinal found out about it. And when we think of our church, we think much more about the 2 Marys than about on any of the priests who came in mind. In fact, when the first one, Mary Kincaid, retired, students came back from around the country to say, when I was having trouble with my studies, it was Mary who got me through. Or when we were having marital problems, it was Mary who was there with us. So as priests diminish in importance, as they should, by the way, there are no priests in the letters of Paul or in the Gospels. None of them are called priests. No one call each other that. None of them talk about offering sacrifice. Paul has many ministries, many gifts of the Spirit, readers, exorcists, etc., etc., etc. No priests. The priests are a later invention. So I think that this Pope can't say, oh, I'm going to make women priests. What he has to do is encourage the women who are there, which he's doing. For instance, on the Sexual Abuse Commission, he's put not only lay people, but women, and 2 victims of sexual abuse. Secrecy, as we were just hearing, is, in the case of Pius XII's papers, secrecy is a great breeder of corruption. And the church has always loved, the institutional church has always loved secrecy. Remember, I said that the synod was kept secret by John Paul. It was meant to be an open thing. Well, this Pope has opened it up again. He's opened up a number of things. For instance, when the UN called the Vatican before the Human Rights Commission, the delegate who was sent there admitted what the Vatican had never admitted, that 700 to 800 priests were dismissed, were unfrocked. That was a secret. It's no longer one. They didn't want people to know the scale of it. And of course, that only is slightly represents the scale of it. But he's been opening up so far as possible all along. And as I say, he told the bishops, go consult your flocks. Don't dictate to them. Go consult with them. Go out and get the smell of the sheep. So women are going to play more and more a part. They have to. That's a part of the church, that kind of lag behind the cultures. You know, now women are so important in every culture now, except the church. He called off the investigation of the American nuns, which was an absurd thing at the outset. He didn't do it right away, as we just heard. He can't dictate all of these things. But the investigation of them turned into a celebration of them. Couldn't have been more praising than what the Vatican finally came out with.
Right, the one last question over there on the edge. Yes.
Jerry, Shane, both of you have said the Pope can't do it all, but he's the Pope. There's no basis or no method to recall him. Why can't he do it all? Why can't he just say, if he wanted to, we're no longer opposed to contraception, even though there's a lot of resistance to it? Why can't he do it all?
Well, other than, okay, I'll throw this over to Professor Wills, but other than splitting the church, I mean, yes, he can do it all. It's a non-hereditary absolute monarchy. When one dies, another one comes in, not by family connection, and although they have a Congress, there's really no limitation in terms of that hierarchy, in terms of the power of the Pope. A decree can be absolute and carry the day on doctrine as well, but the split would be tremendous on issues. When the Supreme Court came down with Roe versus Wade, it split a country in the 1970s, before that country was ready for it. So two different sides of a view on that issue. If the Pope stepped into issues, although he had the technical power to do that, the church would be upside down, I believe.
The Pope was a monarch. He's not now. Some people may think so, but as we just heard from Mr. Posner, that's when he ruled a real big chunk of Europe. He doesn't anymore. And he does not have a monarch's power of fiat, and he shouldn't. If he did that, I think not only would conservatives pay no attention, I think liberals wouldn't. That's not what a pope should be. A pope should be the chief shepherd, and the idea that the pope is the church was renounced by the Second Vatican Council. It said the pope is not the church, the people of God are the church.
Right, well, I wanted to give a huge thanks. Please help me in thanking Gerald Posner and Garry Wills.
Thank you.
Your comments have been absolutely fascinating, very insightful. Thanks to all of you for the wonderful, wonderful questions, and we look forward to seeing many of you again soon at another Chicago Council on Global Affairs event.